Welcome back. We are continuing with muscle physiology. This should be a short video. We're just going to talk about the contraction and relaxation of skeletal muscle fibers. We've already discussed in a previous video about the neuromuscular junction. We spoke about the NMJ, how you have calcium influx, and when you have calcium influx to the synaptic end bulb, the neurotransmitter acetylcholine is released into the synaptic cleft. The acetylcholine binds to the motor end plate on the muscle, to the sodium channel. The sodium channel opens. You get activation, excitation, depolarization. It goes down the transverse tubule, butts up against the sarcoplasmic reticulum, where the sarcoplasmic reticulum released calcium, right? And the calcium is going to remove troponin, so tropomyosin shifts, and the myosin head can connect to the actin. So what we're seeing here is right here, we see that the myosin head is actually connecting to the actin where the binding site is, because here the binding sites are exposed. How did they get exposed? Well, it looks like calcium right here came in and it removed troponin so that the tropomyosin can shift. When it shifted, it opened up and exposed these binding sites on actin so that myosin can come up and connect. Remember I said, here's the elbow, then here's the wrist. You see how there's a flick at the wrist as well, creating the power stroke or the contraction? I also want you to pay attention at the cross bridge here where they connect. You can see that there's ADP and P. Now let me just show you here. Let's see if I can, let's choose blue. So let's say here is adenosine, and then it can bind to one phosphate. Then we call that adenosine monophosphate, right? AMP. If we phosphorylate it again, now we have ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate because there's two. If we phosphorylate it one more time, now we have 1, 2, 3 phosphates. Now we have adenosine triphosphate, ATP. Okay, so right here on the top left, we see that we have adenosine diphosphate with a phosphate hanging out right next to it. Now, usually when you see a phosphate hanging out next to it, it's actually called CP, which is creatine phosphate, CP, creatine phosphate. Phosphate binds to creatine. And this is fast, quick energy, like a quick burst of energy, like a power lifter uses CP. Okay, so this means that you have this, right? You have ADP with a creatine phosphate hanging out right next to it. But when they join forces, you get ATP. All right, but when you have lots of energy and storage, your body is going to keep ADP with CP next to it. You see it here, ADP and phosphate right next to it. Now, what did I say is needed to detach the myosin head from actin? ATP. You need energy for that detachment. So where did this ATP come from? Right here. We had creatine phosphate hooked up with ADP. So now you have ADP hooking up with another phosphate. You got 3 phosphates, ATP. After it detaches, it hydrolyzes it and breaks it back into adenosine diphosphate and creatine phosphate again. Okay? We're going to get into how the body ends up making this energy. So let's look at the muscle metabolism. You heard me mention creatine phosphate before. That's kind of important. So how do muscles derive that energy that's needed to power the contraction cycle? Well, we have creatine phosphate, which is fast, quick, immediate energy. We have anaerobic glycolysis, which means oxygen is not readily available. And then we have aerobic respiration or cellular respiration, which is when you're in a surplus of oxygen. So here's that CP that we mentioned before, creatine phosphate. So here's ATP, and we said when you have an abundance of it, we can store some of that ATP by having ADP and creatine phosphate, that's CP. Because if we join these two together and bring these two back together, you get two phosphates plus a third, you get ATP again. Right? So here's creatine phosphate, and that's what we're doing right here. Creatine phosphate is joining ADP, and what do we get? ATP. When it's hydrolyzed, ATP goes back to ADP, and there is your CP, your creatine phosphate. Okay? And the enzyme that helps to do this is called creatine kinase. Remember, anything that ends in ACE is an enzyme. That's going to catalyze the transfer of the phosphate group, right? The phosphate group is this, creatine phosphate. It just transfers it from creatine phosphate to ADP. And when it does that, it yields ATP, which is right here. Now, at rest, as I said, the muscle produces more energy or more ATP than we really need. So the ATP transfers some of that energy to creatine, right? So here's the ATP. It's going to transfer one of these phosphates over to creatine. So what do you get? What is ATP with one less phosphate? ADP. And then what does creatine here become when it gains that phosphate? CP, creatine phosphate. Okay, and during each contraction, the myosin head breaks down that ATP to produce ATP and creatine phosphate. It's a reversible reaction. ADP plus creatine phosphate with that creatine phosphokinase enzyme creates ATP. Now the CPK is in muscle cells. So if this is a muscle cell and it has CPK, let's say it happens to be a heart muscle cell, and then this heart muscle cell starts to rupture right here, then the CPK leaks out. When it leaks out and it goes into your blood vessels, and the amount of CPK in your arteries go up, your doctors are going to go, I think I'm having a heart attack. Your heart cells are dying. We have too much of this enzyme leaching into muscle. Okay? Or the person is exercising really, really, really super hard, high intensity training. They damaged a lot of their muscles. That's a possibility too. So a good case history needs to be taken. Now, in terms of this energy, let's take a look here. We have glucose, right? Now, glucose is a 6-carbon sugar. Looks like this, right? 6 carbons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's a 6-carbon sugar. That's glucose right there. When you break down glucose, we call it glycolysis. This term lysis means to break down. Glycolysis is the breakdown of glucose. So how do you break down glucose? All we're doing is splitting it right here. When you split that, you get 2 3-carbon sugars. you get something that looks like this. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. We have 2 3-carbon sugars, and that's pyruvic acid. Okay? That happens in the cytosol, right? In the cell. Then pyruvic acid in the presence of oxygen. That's really important. This is aerobic. You need to have O2 or oxygen. That pyruvic acid enters the mitochondria. When it enters the mitochondria, it goes through the Krebs cycle where it makes some ATP. Not much, but it makes some. But what the Krebs cycle does is that it provides the chemical energy for the electron transport chain to function, and that produces lots of ATP. The electron transport chain is dependent on iron, and it is dependent on CoQ10 to function. CoQ10. That's why when people are iron deficient, iron deficiency anemia, people are fatigued because they have no energy, they have no ATP. When a woman is menstruating, she's losing blood, she's losing iron, right? No energy, no ATP. Okay. So I also want to show you, since I mentioned here the CoQ10, when people are on statins, right, many of my students are getting into healthcare, a large percentage of the population is on cholesterol medication. So when I come back, I'm going to show you how cholesterol medication can be very damaging to your energy and to your mitochondria.